Hi everyone, it's Myles Runham here. I'm a senior analyst with Fosway Group, so I'm responsible for coverage of the digital learning segment with Fosway, amongst other HR and learning topics. I'm really excited today to be joined by Rob MacAllister, who's the Customer Success Director with Valamis. We're talking through a number of themes today, as sort of set up for some other activity as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the value proposition for learning and development and learning functions is shifting and needs to shift. We'll talk a little bit as well about the skills imperative, almost as an example of that shift, and talk a little bit then about the capabilities and the skills that learning functions need to adopt. A lot of this theme is around the use of evidence, intelligence, and data, which is one of the sort of the foundation principles for Valamis. So anyway, before I go on too long, I'll introduce Rob. So Rob, do you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself and about your role at Valamis?
Thanks, Myles. Hi, everyone. As Myles mentioned, my name is Rob MacAllister. I'm based in London, and I'm our Customer Success Director at Valamis. What that means for our customers is I own the post-sales experience in terms of making sure that our customers maximise their usage of the platform. But most importantly, we understand the desired outcomes that our customers have when using our platform, and we do everything we possibly can to achieve those outcomes. That could be something very foundational, such as compliance, but it could be also something incredibly ambitious, such as going through a very large reskilling experience within an organisation. So we're a global team. The team is packed full of educational experience, benefiting from the wonderful Finnish educational system. Means that we have lots of very well qualified educational designers with very strong backgrounds, which means that we try to partner with our customers and make sure that we are continually challenging our customers to make the most of Valamis, but also the ongoing trends and discussion points across the industry.
That's great. Thanks, Rob. You've already hit on a few themes, I guess, that we probably like to speak about today. I mean, there's a range of objectives and needs that learning and development functions and your customer groups are faced by. So from something, like you said, that might be more familiar, like compliance, through to a range of more strategic, like skills development, as an interesting example. So I suppose we can see that learning and development is being stretched, perhaps in a number of different directions. And that has certain implications. I'm from Fosway's point of view. The research that we've done over the last number of years, but perhaps sort of more refreshed in the last 18 months, has shown in the broader HR world that there's a lot of, I guess, additional pressure, you might call it, or there's sources of disruption for businesses. I think we've seen, and it's quite easy to get quite dramatic about it in a way, but we've seen of the impact of the pandemic, what that's done to working patterns, what that's done to people's sense of security, participation in the workplace, expectations, etc. There's been supply chain disruption. There's disruption even from sort of pricing impacts and inflation, armed conflict. It feels almost like a bewildering array of subjects and requirements that business are looking at, and then that in turn sort of arrives in the HR field as with these themes of strategic partnership, skills development, the broader themes of employee engagement. So learning and development is being asked as a function to participate perhaps in ways that it hadn't typically been, or to expand from some of those more familiar goals. I mean, in Valamis's terms, has that changed the way that you work with your customers, some of those sort of broader strategic themes, or are the conversations similar but sort of reflected with sort of perhaps bit of a different context?
Well, I think one of the things that has definitely changed, which we've experienced at Valamis, is you mentioned conflict. We had 50 people located in Russia that we moved over into our Finnish office. Not all of them came, but that was a huge disruption to our business and challenge in terms of cultural integration. Luckily, our HQ in Joensuu is 50 miles from the Russian border, so it wasn't as if we were moving from Helsinki to St. Petersburg. But that, of course, internally made a large difference in terms of our workforce, in terms of how culturally people are immersed. And that happened before I joined the business, but I think I was very surprised and really kind of proud that the organisation had supported so many people to cross the border if they so wished. In terms of our customers, I think what we're starting to see, obviously in 2020, we had the remote work explosion. And I think from speaking to many organisations, they're still having to get their head around that. Different organisations or different sectors have very different strategies of the return to work policy, which I do find hilarious, return to office policy rather than work, because hopefully everyone's working at home. But I think that's something that, depending on the sector, is a really hot topic, but others it's not. We work with some organisations that are generally more software technology based, and they're very happy to have people work from home or work remotely for the majority of their week, and that changes the way that they're designing their learning. Classroom-based events, obviously in person, have really diminished in terms of the way that they procure content or even create content. The instructional designers have had to change their roles and their usage of the platform and become very, I guess, more au fait with an online platform rather than PowerPoint and being able to just put something together in the technology that you've used for a very long time. And I think the other thing that we're starting to see is people are coming to us and starting to try to navigate that skills conundrum a little bit more. So I think that's not necessarily due to many of the pandemic or obviously conflict, but in terms of technological prowess, I think there is a lot more understanding of the need or the want to move towards be a skills-based organisation rather than a role-based organisation. We have built the platform in collaboration, obviously, with many of our customers to start to embrace that a lot more as well. So we're starting to see, as a solution, we are becoming more skills obsessed and focused to support what our customers are asking for, on top of all of, like I say, the kind of mandatory compliance elements as well.
I think it's interesting thinking about skills as a sort of perhaps a standout example of this strategic value that's required from learning functions. It's interesting to see how much of that now is intelligence and data led as well. So I think you were talking about the context of skills development in the organization. That skills means different things in different sectors, different businesses have different priorities, but all faced with similar requirements to bring in new skills, to develop new skills or refresh old ones, etc. But identifying what to prioritize, where the gaps are, and how to sort of manage the development through those gaps is a really important piece of the context for an organization. Perhaps we'll talk a little bit about how that manifests itself for an individual. But I mean, it would be interesting to get your view on how you help organizations gather that intelligence, apply analysis to that, identify their gaps and priorities, because just to help manage and focus the effort feels like quite an important nut to crack for many businesses.
Yeah, and as I'm sure at Fosway and yourself, Myles, you're very familiar with skills taxonomies and competency frameworks and how difficult they can be to get perfect, and they continually iterate. So I think one of the things that we really advise our customers is it's okay to go with a 80% draft or 80% there to then be able to iterate and improve. One of the articles that our marketing team put together at the beginning of this year was about AGI and I would say the explosion of ChatGPT, and the fact that actually maybe you need to have a prompt writing skill, or let's actually break that down to be more copywriting and efficiency writing. In terms of the way that we help our customers, a lot of it is about how, I guess, utilization of certain parts of our platform. So where can skills be used, where can they not be used, and what's the importance of that framework? It's not surprising, but all of our customers are at a very different maturity level of their own skills strategy. We can speak to some, very large Fortune 50 FCMG organization, and they have a really robust skill strategy. It's been their CLO's main priority for the past 5 years, and they've gone through huge transformation internally. So their skill strategy is really robust, and they would be kind of more at the advanced stage of, I would say, what excellence looks like. But then we also have much smaller organizations, or just more, not necessarily smaller, but I guess the change management effort is much larger because of the industry they're in, where they're not specializing necessarily in particular skills, and it's more high level, it's more managerial, soft skills, and the hard skills that maybe are a little bit higher level, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think one of my frustrations, or one of my dreams, if I could be the skill czar of the world, would be to standardize or normalize skill descriptions across all countries, all organizations. I remember another organization I worked with going into one of the UK supermarkets, and that was the dream of their head of L&D, is actually we don't need to define adaptability as a skill. There should be a generic adaptability definition that we can all share across the UK. So if someone wants to move jobs from one organisation to the other, it's very easy to understand, okay, Myles is excellent at adaptability, but what if we define that differently? Or what if excellence in one organisation is different to the other? So I think the advantage of working with an organisation like ourselves is, like I mentioned, the educational background of many of my team is we can help advise and consult and benchmark your definition of a particular skill. And that's not to say that it's wrong, but we can also reference to another organisation and say, well, they're defining it this way, and this is the maturity of that organisation. Where do you think you fit, or where do you need to be? And there's many ways that an organisation can utilise, obviously, skills in terms of content, events, but in terms of the skill gap orientation, is we ask our customers or our learners in the platform, we have the ability in the platform to be able to identify skill gaps very easily via our reporting. Skills are self-assessed, so you can come in and say this is where somebody needs to be within a particular role or a demographic within the organisation, and this is where people are self-assessing, and we can start to push content if we wish, or put people into various audiences or segments. Audiences is what we call internally. That could be a segment or a group, whatever you would like to call it, to start to nudge that learner or user to be aware of other elements of that skill that they should then start to develop as part of either their role or part of the project that they're working on.
You know, that's really interesting, Robert. It's really interesting sort of to start to look at the detail, but I'd like to just take you back to something you referenced a bit earlier about perhaps, you know, this is as an industry how we do or don't work together, and how we could and should. But I think there's something interesting about sort of maybe there's a rebalancing in the skills conversation that traditionally, and this is a generalization, but traditionally organizations would be developing skills for the business. So this is the skills that we need for our workforce, however configured, you know, to face the future, to compete, to thrive, and that, you know, that could be skills for revenue growth and profitability. It could be for efficiency. It could be for culture and communication. There's never one answer, as you said. But I think there's something kind of interesting now with the way that there's a bit of a rebalancing, perhaps, and now the relevance of skills for an individual is perhaps rising in popularity and balancing a little bit about the skills relevance for the organization. You know, what does that mean about understanding the context for an individual, but also about the portability and the sort of that sort of career growth, lifetime learning, you might call it. You know, so these are skills for me and my career, as well as skills for the organization's benefit. And there's an interesting sort of, I suppose, perhaps there's a bit of a tension sometimes between, you know, the relevance of individual skills for me, because it's important for me, and how those skills are then supported and nurtured in the organization. Is that dynamics shifting, you know, in the way that you work with your customers as well?
Yeah, like I say, it very much depends on the maturity of our customers. If they have a mature skill strategy, then they are starting to embrace the talent mobility that you know we read about and really aspire to, where people are organised based on projects, or if their particular role has 20% of loose time, they are then pulled into a project that accentuates their skills, and they can start to identify the needs and wants for their passion projects. Many of our customers that we work with, it's not about that they're immature, but there's a real focus on the compliance element of making sure that they are compliant, because of the value that is associated to that is so much higher in terms of the risk, let's say, than the continual advancement or identifying the skills gaps within an organisation. So it really depends, which is a rubbish answer, and I'm sorry I can't be more definitive. But obviously with our customers, we've got such a scale of enterprise to mid-market organisations. It really depends on the size of the team as well, and that's generally what I would say is lots of the aspirational elements that we talk about as an industry in terms of talent mobility, moving away from roles and to focus on skills. They are so reliant on a large team and a connected team across multiple departments. I've worked in the industry now for nearly a decade, and one of the main kind of pain points that you would say from a commercial perspective is small team, big dreams.
Right.
And that is continuous in the L&D industry. We work with organizations that may have 5,000 people, but have 2 or 3 people in the L&D team. And that ratio to me, regardless of how wonderful and amazing those 3 people are, seems kind of insane. Like you mentioned at the very beginning, that the growing needs of an organization on learning and development to now cover a wider spectrum than ever and be better and stronger at absolutely everything. I feel like we put ourselves under quite a lot of pressure within the learning and development industry when actually the needs have got wider and wider and wider, and it's great that we want to aspire to be able to fulfill those needs. But we also kind of need to put the mirror up and go, you need to help us and support us to be able to get there too.
Yeah, it's a good point, isn't it? Because it's very easy to say, well, the industry should be more like this, and we should all be better in these ways that I think are probably quite well rehearsed in a lot of the commentary, and and Fosway's research would support it and perhaps define some of that. I think one of the areas that I find interesting is the sort of there's something that feels important about relationship building for learning and development. This is a kind of skills area for L&D, I guess, in order to support that, sort of strategic development in the business, whether small or large. And there's a couple of areas of relationship development, I think, that feel really important. I think you sort of described them both a little bit as you were talking, but I think there's something about, building relationships with those around you in the organization. If you're in a small team, you can't do everything. So you need to work with others, partnering, you might call it, and relationship building with those that can support you and help set that direction. I think there's something really important about kind of audience and user or learner relationship building as well. That can be research based, it can be informal, but I think the more confident you are from the strength of those relationships, it helps you then work through priorities, work through communication on both sides. I don't know if that makes sense in in your experience, yourself as a professional, but also as a in your customer success role.
Absolutely, and I think I of course I'm going to say this because it aligns with my experience, but I think actually the people that we work with that are really excellent at more and I want to say mature rather than advanced, but more mature in their thinking towards skill strategy, generally have a mixed experience. They're not L&D or HR lifers. They've come from a different industry, they've come from a different role. I was talking to one organisation yesterday, and the person we were talking to mentioned that he worked at a large consultancy firm, and because of his role within kind of L&D, he managed to know more partners than the majority of partners at a large, and the partners are the kind of kingmakers in the organisation. So for them, it was a fantastic overview and be able to get insight into various parts of the business. And I think that is so important to be able to win the hearts and minds of this is important. One of the big challenges, I would say, that many of our I say customers, but I think anyone in the industry, is that you have to fight with your comms team to get out the communications to say this is really important. And we hear throughout my career in the L&D industry is comms are sending something out next week about the new lunch menu in the canteen. We won't send this out about X, Y, Z. And it's that gravitas internally, which I do think is changing because of, you mentioned the disruption within the world, but it's also the skill set of widening, of being slightly more self-sufficient, of there are now so many tools available. We've just been using Canva. I've started to use it I help run a basketball team outside of work, and I've been putting together social media templates for it. And it is absolutely incredible. In terms of things that I would have done 10 years ago and taken me 2 hours, I can do in 2 minutes. And we've actually started to adopt using that at work for some customers and putting together what I would like to think are really fantastic promotional videos or user guides using a tool like Canva. Whereas I remember when I was at university, it was Final Cut Pro 7 certified, and I sat and did 2 days worth of a course, and I don't remember any of it now, but I remember thinking I was really good at video editing. And I think it's that kind of self-sufficiency that is very important within a lot of L&D teams, because if you can prove that you can do something at a small scale with the small team, like I mentioned, then it starts to position the art of the possible. Of actually, if you gave us this marketer or the communication resource, we'd take this from kind of an 8 to a 9. So you're completely right. I think the age-old discussion within the L&D industry has been, we are order takers. And I think the only way that that can change, and I do feel like that is very much changing based on some of the conversations we have, is to be able to go into many meetings with two ears and listen as much as possible, make sure that we're understanding what the value we can provide, but also having that curiosity to say, but things can be better. We don't have to just hear that this is the way we want to do something, and come armed with the resources to be able to change someone's heart and mind to again, bring the maturity of an organisation through.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well that I think there's something kind of helpful in maybe thinking a bit more broadly and a bit more open-mindedly about what evidence and intelligence is as well. I think there's been a justifiable focus on demonstrating ROI of learning, and I think that will never go away. But I think sometimes that perhaps that prevents us from thinking a bit more broadly about what useful evidence can look and feel like. So your example of your contact in the consulting business of having those partner relationships, that's evidence gathering. It may be conversational, it might be anecdotal, but that's very, very helpful intelligence about the landscape, the environment, and clearly is all about prioritization. But I think there's also something interesting about how we then reflect that evidence back into the organization. So, you sort of the example of, using tools on a small scale, finding a team to work with, and then that becomes a success story that you can then build on. Again, that's gathering evidence and reflecting it back. I think sometimes we get stuck on that sort of calculated quantitative ROI conversation, which again, clearly fundamental, not to be rejected, but to be added to and supplemented with other forms of evidence and other ways of talking about the evidence. I think it's quite important as well.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think the openness to experiment. one of not supposed to say I have favourite clients, but I have someone that I've worked with across two organisations now, and works for the large FCMG brand, and his whole mindset is about experimentation. Yes, he wants to prove things, but actually it's not failure if we experiment something and we can make a slight change, even if it is a 5% increase to someone's productivity or an awareness about something. As long as we're continuously learning about what they are trying to test, it works. And the ROI is there in expanding one's knowledge. And I think that to me is a magical mindset, the epitome of growth mindset. And that person is the kind of skills leader with growth mindset within that organization. But you're right, there is always that focus. I think as an organization we focus, or as an industry, we focus on ROI, but my team's role is to speak to a customer and ask them what are they trying to achieve, and trying to pin numbers on that can be very, very hard. And that covers the maturity level. Some smaller organizations or less mature organizations will come in with metrics and say, we want 100 people in the system, we want to make sure everyone's in there. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But obviously, like you say, with the reorganization of our profession or our kind of sector, being able to go to the CFO and go, this is what I am doing. That's the age-old discussion at the moment with many of our customers is, the finance director is under a lot of pressure here. I don't want my team to have any unnecessarily cuts here. So how do I validate everything we're doing? Is that kind of increased? One organization we're working with has done a fantastic study where they have managed to look at the length of content and the completion rates of compliance modules. So if they can save minutes across thousands of people, then there is a real cost to the business of being able to say Myles and Rob are both compliant in 8 minutes rather than 16. And what cost is that back to the business? And it's required us to investigate. And the results that they've achieved have been kind of incredible. They've reduced the time of people to become compliant and not seen a drop off in people's activities. I think it's between 30 and 40%. So that to me, the ROI is, yes, it's a cost cut in ROI, but it's also about efficiency and productivity. And I do feel like sometimes I don't read enough about people talking about the productivity gains of what we do. Productivity is impossible. And the irony of two Brits here talking about productivity, one of the least productive countries in the world, if you read any kind of reports. But the productivity gains that our industry is able to provide by upskilling and reskilling, and then the effect that comes from that is something that I would love more people, if anyone listens to this and has a case study, to be able to send over to me, because I'd love to read that.
I think it's interesting. You've hit on some really interesting points there. There's something about experimentation and sort of that build, measure, learn, which I'd like to come back to. But I think there's something really interesting in that example about, time saving and the power of that as a metric for the right audience. So, if, like you said, for your finance director or your CFO, and the stakeholders involved with those decisions, that's a really, really powerful piece of information, and works well. How you got there probably is almost, don't show you're working out for that audience. And I think that thing about actually, that we need to be confident in knowing that we're, managing as well as possible, and we're gathering data as well as possible within, the operational efficiency of learning and development. That might not be what we communicate, but we know that we're confident that that data is solid when we do communicate it. I think it also references them for other people. So it might be, perhaps, I don't know, your marketing director is interested in, developing commercial skills. Time saved, perhaps less relevant. That would be useful, but they want to know the skills impact, and the capability, and then, how that affects their metrics. So I think there's something about choosing the information that, and developing our confidence around those business metrics and how we contribute to them, that feels really important.
Yeah, and I think many of our organizations, or not many of the organizations we necessarily work with, but from speaking from experience, their learning ecosystem is rather large at some of our larger clients. And one of the metrics that they have generally is to be able to reduce not the distractions, but the journey to be able to get there, because of the uncaptured inefficiency of having to search for information. The Netflix problem of spending 20 minutes to find something on Netflix that you want to watch. I think within many large organizations, one can spend 5 minutes searching for something, even at an organization the size of Valamis. We're 150 people, and we have lots of systems because we have lots of different teams, and being able to find that one voice of reason, or that one killer document about how to do something, can sometimes take a couple of minutes, or ideally we'd be able to snap our fingers and be able to do that. And I think with the introduction of various AI models or large language models, I'm sure that will improve over the next 12 months if many corporations open their doors and legal teams allow them to plug into one of these models. But there's so many kind of inefficiencies within work that it's not to say that we become an operations team and improve operations, but by being able to educate and improve people's skills to be able to pull things in one place, but then also give them the skills to kind of become more productive, I think is such a powerful thing. And something I think that I'm personally very passionate about. I hate inefficiency. It's a very personality fault, I think, or maybe something good about my personality. But from a economics point of view and from a GDP point of view, if you want to continue to grow as a country, one has to become more efficient and become more productive and maximize what you have. So I think it's something that I personally really would love to, like I say, hear more about. If organizations have fantastic case studies or experiments, to go back to what I said about the experimentation, I said, did it fail? I think one point I would make on that, in that kind of open request of send me information, is I used to work in the music industry, and I worked for a consultancy, and we went into record labels, management teams, and taught them about how to do various things. This was 2013. Set up your Facebook page, set up your Amazon page. But one thing that organization did was have a kind of best campaigns of the year, and it was a very prestigious thing. And we would get every record label or every management company want to be in that kind of the annual, this is what the best campaigns are. But we forced people to actually give us the insight of how they did it. So there's a real transparency about someone achieving an excellent result. And I would love our sector or our industry to be able to do that a little bit more. I find there's similar with our podcast here, maybe there's lots of discussion around how we can improve, but actually I would love to see a little bit more detail of this is what we did, and we created a 5% increase. 5% can still be a very sexy number depending on the scale, and there's still a lot that we can learn in terms of that information share and transfer between organizations and partners.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that one of the ways that perhaps we can we can take some small steps, within our own organisations, is working with functions, to understand how do they do that. I think we always talk about learning should be more like marketing, but I think in one of the areas, particularly with digital marketing, that's seems very successful and has created a lot of momentum, is that the ability to describe and explain, inputs and outputs and outcomes. Therefore, I think there's something interesting about building those relationships, maybe working with the owners of data sources internally to help understand how can you correlate learning data with those data sources, etc. I think that's one of the ways you can start to then expand that that sense of sort of working openly. I think the industry has some way to go in terms of standardizing. Actually, I think we've standardized some sort of technical areas up to a point. But I think that sort of openness and standardization of sort of operations and measurement will help, and I think there are ways of doing. I think there are ways of doing that without sort of sharing important secrets as well. A lot of industries do manage that. I think we've got some way to go. Although I'm quite optimistic that we can get there. Actually, I do think that sort of openness theme has never gone away, and perhaps it's gathering a bit more momentum more recently.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the digital marketing again, because to go back to what we said about the importance of skills, I think the first time I was aware, let's say, of a more skill-specific strategy rather than a role-specific strategy was, I think in 2017, where the term in the marketing industry of a T-shaped marketer. And I'm not sure whether you're familiar with that, but it was the whole idea of foundational knowledge, which then you focus on one thing, whether that is paid for advertising, copywriting, so on and so forth. And it feels like that is slowly starting to become more prevalent across other industries and other roles of, you have to have a foundational knowledge, and you may have to have different levels of foundational knowledge, but that fine-tune and focus on a particular point, whether that's because you're passionate about it or whether it's because you're naturally very gifted in it, feels like we're obviously borrowing very different strategies from different parts of different industries, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And the thing that I love about my role, I listened to a podcast last weekend with Rory Sutherland, I don't know what his exact role is, but he works at Ogilvy, and he summarised his love for his role, and I would probably share exactly the same sentiment, which was the reason why he loves working in advertising is because every single interaction within his life is a learning point to be able to then affect what he does next. So an interaction with someone buying coffee could then change how he talks to a client about his interaction. And I think we're very lucky within our industry to do the same. I watched my daughter grow up and learn things, and it changed my perception of how people in my team may learn. And I think that's the beautiful thing and very inspiring thing about our sector and our roles. We're very privileged to be able to kind of apply every human interaction to kind of reform how we do things or how we can get people to learn. And I'd highly recommend that podcast episode. It's Rory Sutherland with Rick Rubin. It's a 4-hour podcast, so it's not really an episode, it's like an audio book, but it is incredible in terms of human insights and behavioural sciences and psychology.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, isn't it? We talked about that theme of learning, and for me, and this has been sort of part of my own personal sort of career background, but also something I think we've seen from Fosway's point of view and working, with our corporate network, on sort of the corporate side of the equation, that the most successful functions are the ones that do, whether you call it experimentation, piloting, testing, different organizations have different ways of working, but that sense of, sort of build, measure, learn, that product management approach, I think is really, really important. And I think it's something that the industry is getting better at. And it feels like there's something important in that way of working and way of thinking that brings in, sort of triangulates your user and audience insight with your business insight, and the relationships, that you've been describing, but also like that, with the sort of technology and the digital environment, it brings those three elements together to understand, your prioritization, and then, sort of test towards priorities. I
was just going to ask, in terms of your, your work with Fosway, do you have, in terms of those like best practices with regard to experimentation, in terms of length of experiments, do you see kind of a standardization across many of the organizations you work with, or does it really vary?
No, I think it probably varies, not necessarily by organization, but by context. So I think, if you sort of something like, you're developing a development program or a learning program, with a capital P, it's much harder to experiment with that, because you've got, that's more about probably the research and investigation that leads you up to, perhaps piloting. And so you sort of do more up front to be more confident as you start and pilot and develop from there. I think probably then it's more about the context of using tools. Maybe this is more about managing content and content creation and publishing, where that cycle of experimentation can be quicker, but also perhaps you can do more in terms of, maybe you can release different types of content. You can do more of that kind of A/B testing. So I think it's more about the context, and also, as you said, it's about sort of capability and time as well. You need to be realistic that in a busy day with a small team, an experiment's not necessarily welcome because you've got stuff to do. So I think you need to be realistic about it. I suppose I think it's more the confidence in the uncertainty, really, that you haven't got the answer yet, and you need to work to find the best solution, but not the perfect solution. And I think there's something that requires a bit of confidence in judgment as well from experience, which is a bit counterintuitive, and it's hard to let go of. You think in 3 months' time we know where we'll be. Actually, well, you won't. But in 3 months' time you'll be confident that you took good steps in the right direction, and you know more about where you need to go next. I think it's a sort of shift in mindset as much as it is, sort of an application of particular techniques. I was thinking, Rob, because we've talked through a number of different themes of sort of the sort of defining intelligence, evidence gathering, working with it. We've talked about experimentation. We've talked a little bit about the application of the systems in the ecosystem and the landscape. If you were going to give advice to someone who's starting out in the industry, or maybe they're taking their first sort of more managerial role, what kind of advice would you give them to take their first steps in sort of gathering and applying evidence to the way they work and how they solve their problems?
Probably two things, and one is maybe going to be very obvious to you and listeners. The other one will maybe a bit more not surprising, but off kilter. The first one is to become very, very familiar with data. And when I say familiar, being able to interpret data, understanding, you mentioned A/B testing, but being able to look at a very basic chart and understand what is the story to tell here. I mentioned with the podcast recommendation, behavioral sciences, and to understand what makes people tick. But being able to look at, take a large chunk of data, you've got 10,000 employees, and being able to very quickly put that into a pivot table and summarize just the data at a very basic level, I think is something that still many people struggle to do. So being able to do that within kind of a managerial level, particularly from a managerial level, because it increases the importance of being able to summarize what your team are doing and what's necessary. And I would expect this will be very outdated when I talk about pivot tables, because in the next month it will be in code interpreter in ChatGPT, and it will do it for us. But I think that would be my first top tip, is to become very familiar or literate in data. It doesn't mean going to do a data science course. It doesn't mean having to go on to various wonderful content providers and become certified, but being able to look at a chart and understand what it means. You don't have to be able to label axes, but again, being able to understand the story that you could then tell somebody and say, this is why it's important. And to refer back to something we said about content times and the completion rates, there's a sweet spot between 3 to 6 minutes based on all of our data that we show. Maybe we should change things. That's a really, I would say, easy thing to be able to learn. You could start to test that with data quite quickly to be able to come up with a very strong hypothesis of where things move. The second one, which ties into that kind of relationship management side, is this might sound snooty, but by the Financial Times weekend, it is less than £5 every weekend. You can subscribe to it. And the reason I say that is because it depends on the size of the organisation. But for someone like me that works with lots of enterprises, it is invaluable to be able to get a high-level overview of what's going on within various industries, whether that is merger and acquisitions, whether that is energy markets. You're able to come and speak to your client or your boss, whether consulting firm or whatever, from a very educated view which gives you such credibility when you talk to people about why they should do things. If you can reference that what the competitor is doing this and you've just read about it in the Financial Times, I imagine most people's bosses' ears will prick up and go, yeah, maybe we should look at that a bit more too. And I think I've now used that tactic for the past 4 years. All my family laugh at me because I think I'm a real snob reading this pink newspaper on the weekends. But it is so valuable to get a wider perspective across nationalities or countries as well, because of the world element. And then you have the very business related element of, what is an organization doing well? Regardless of your age or your experience, I think that's a really valuable tool to just get that foundation of business insights and awareness. And just to be aware of other organisations' names, we talk about enterprises and FTSE 100s and NASDAQs and various things like that, but actually reading about those organisations and what they do is a fantastic best practice. I think that gives everybody the foundation, like I say, to be able to have a very good discussion, or at least a discussion that's based on foundational awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think so. There's something there about, you said, data literacy, which is, it feels really important. Understanding sources, understanding what you can and can't do with them, their strengths and weaknesses, understanding, how they can be manipulated and how you can manipulate them, and how to do that, sort of with confidence of accuracy and truthfulness, etc. I think it's really interesting as well, sort of understanding those business dynamics more broadly than your own function, but also more broadly than your organization, your business. What's happening in the sector, what's happening in related sectors. I think there's something that I would add to that is I think those are brilliant, and I will steal them. I would add sort of testing in conversation as well. I think there's something that the value of conversations, back to that sort of relationship theme, is almost a useful way of testing it before you even get to a hypothesis. You think, I've read this, or I've seen that, or I've just noticed this in a report. You have that conversation just with your peers, with your networks. Test your thinking before you look before you leap, in a sense. Conversationally, I think can be really helpful as well.
Have you heard of the Amazon press release strategy when they pitch a new project?
I don't know that I have, no.
So whenever it's a new product idea or a project, there's a rule in Amazon, and there's loads of, there's so many people that will probably be able to tell us more about Amazon and read detailed books of the way they work. But there's two things that I love, and I've tried this at varying scales with teams that I've managed. One is to be able to write a detailed document about the meeting. And if it's an hour meeting, you force everybody to read that document within the first 10 minutes. So nobody has an excuse of not reading the document or pretending that they've read the document. And it means that you can then have 50 minutes of detailed conversation. Did that at a previous role, and it was very awkward for the first couple of weeks, but it was fantastic to be able to get everybody to have a detailed discussion, like I said. But the one that relates to your point in terms of testing is to validate any product improvement or functionality or feature at Amazon. Supposedly they have to write the press release first. So you reverse engineer it and go, this is what it will do, and this is exactly who it will be for, this is how we're going to sell this. And I adore that idea of being able to think about the end product at first. You test that with your audience, and you pitch that and go, does this actually feel like it solves the problem if I describe it this way? And then we'll go and do it. And you have this kind of that North Star metric of this press release to say, as long as we fulfill what's in the press release, then we're good. We've had approval. We know it will make an impact within the organization.
You hear yourself say it out loud, and then you say, does that sound convincing? Yeah, it's interesting. I worked with an advertising client. This is before I joined Fosway, some years ago now. I was working with them on the kind of operations and the business planning to set up a learning function for the advertising industry. So a learning service, really, to try and help develop entry-level skills in the advertising sector. And they were wondering how to go about that, what kind of programs to create. And what they did, they promoted some free webinars just on their sort of top 5, I think it was, topics, just to see what's the response. Do people, are people interested? They weren't even necessarily going to run the webinars. It was just sort of market testing exercise. And they did then run a few of the webinars, and that then helped them test, okay, in the ones that we know there's interest, create a light touch sort of half-hour webinar. Have we got the right spokespeople, the right expertise? Have they got the provenance? How do we manage the event? And so they kind of tested their way in right the way through to launch, which is kind of, it was interesting. They weren't live yet, so they didn't, they could do it more in development testing, which gave them a bit more of the freedom. But it's interesting, an example of that, experiment and test your way into confidence, gather the data you don't even know you need yet by trying it out, and suck it and see, which is interesting.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, I think so. We've covered quite an enormous amount of ground, Rob. It's been really interesting and really useful to hear, I think, some of your personal experience, but also the way you work with your customers. So I think what we're going to do next is absorb some of this, get people's ideas and thoughts as the podcast goes out, but we'll build that into some future activity as well. So I know that there's more to come. But I don't know if you have any final words of advice or things to look out for from a Valamis point of view whilst we prepare those next steps with the work that we'll do.
Well, yeah, I won't necessarily say exact things because depending on the release time of this podcast, I don't want to say something that's too far away or too in the past. But our team, our marketing team in particular, is always putting out fantastic research-backed content, in partnership with many of our customers. So please keep an eye out for anything that may come across that. As a team, we're very open to hearing, the needs and the wants of the industry outside of our customers as well. So if something sparks interest that we've discussed, as you say, Myles, it'd be wonderful to get some feedback or some further discussion points for the next one. So we are very much open to anyone's opinions and thoughts about our discussion.
Great. Well, we'll make sure that people know where to find you and your Valamis colleagues. And thanks very much again, Rob. It's been really interesting and really helpful discussion. It's a great way to start the day. Thanks.
Thanks, Myles. It's been wonderful to speak to you too.